How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Rain Race Podcast. I'm your host, GT Rain. Off to my right, off in the Esses, fresh off the 6 hours of the Glen, being there in person. Probably not staying as dry as I was. But apart from that, how was the time you had at the IMSA race?
There's kind of a dual meaning that you there with the not as dry as you were, because either we were sweating buckets with how hot it was, or we were getting poured on come race day. So, you know, can't complain about being at the track for the weekend. But it definitely takes a few days to recover from, that's for sure.
Yeah, if you remember last week's episode, I said I was on the fence about going. There are a couple of variables at play. One of them being actually probably the largest one being the weather. Seeing all week the potential of storms rolling in throughout the race. And ultimately, I made the decision to spend the 6 hours of the Glen assembling furniture from IKEA whilst watching the race on my little screen in my bedroom. So I tried to take in as much of it as I could. I feel like I saw a decent amount. There was another red flag that we saw in an IMSA race, another heavily weather impacted endurance race, and it looks like we might be getting another one of those potentially this weekend with the 6 hours of Spa. So first of all, I'm sorry. This podcast that I ill-named back in 2018 is seeming to not do us too many favors at this point. I love a good rain race every once in a while, but it seems like recently the weather is a little bit too harsh to the point where we're not even getting as much of a race in.
And I don't know if maybe I just thought this a couple of weeks ago, or maybe towards the beginning of June, but I definitely recall at least thinking about, man, we haven't had too many heavily rain impacted races recently. And I can't remember if we talked about it on here or if it just ran through my head, but that sure has changed this month, and the 6 hours of the Glen was no different. But yeah, you didn't make the wrong decision in assembling IKEA furniture. It was weather was tough for the weekend.
Well, and of course, you did not just have the IMSA WeatherTech SportsCar Championship. You were there for all 4 days, if I'm not mistaken. You had plenty of support series action at Watkins Glen. I think Watkins Glen, if it's not still, it used to be the most heavily supported IMSA race on the calendar in terms of the number of support series that IMSA had brought there. And I know this year there was definitely no shortage of that as well.
Yeah, there was Mustang Challenge, their Lamborghini Super Trofeo, Porsche Carrera Cup, and the Michelin Pilot Challenge were all present. No MX5 Cups this year, but which was quite unfortunate, because who doesn't love seeing those rip around the track? But they'll be there next round at CTMP. But actually, on one of those Sports Series races, did you see the accident in the Mustang Challenge? That has to be one of the hardest hits I've seen in a while.
I did see that, and very, very lucky. I'm blanking on the driver off the top of my head. Oh, Nate Cicero, actually.
Yeah.
In the boot with a stuck throttle, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, that's no, it actually wasn't a stuck throttle. It was a rear brake failure.
Wow.
Was what caused that, apparently.
Wow. You would think with the speed he was going, I mean, it looked like the throttle was just pinned the entire way, and I didn't really get a good chance to listen to what the engine was doing during all of it, but definitely a big impact, and we're very glad that he's okay. Luckily, hitting the tire barrier, and looked like a pretty violent flip, but ultimately the safety parameters around the track doing their job and allowing him to get out of that crash mostly unharmed. How do not the MX5, the Mustang Challenge hold up? I know it's the first race that you got to see those cars in person. I have yet to see those cars in person, although they'll be acting as a support race, I just learned, for the WEC race at COTA at the end of August/early September. So that might be my first chance to see those guys on track.
Yeah, I will just say that the Ford parts truck is probably making a killing after the first couple of weekends for them. It's not necessarily not necessarily on track incidents that are responsible for all of it. It seems like there might be a bit of work to do in terms of some of the components were breaking rather easily. But that's just some of the growing pains with a new series. The cars sound incredible. A a large group of Mustang V8s ripping around the track, you're going to be in for a good sounding race. There were some good battles that were going on. We didn't get to watch a ton of the racing because we had to pick and choose what we were going to do, when we were going to go to the infield and things like that. So I didn't get to see a ton of those races, but they have produced some pretty good running in the first couple of weekends. And yeah, if you're going to see them at COTA, then they're going to, at the very least, you're going to be satisfied with the sound. They're also going to be there's an invitational round that's being added next year at the 24 Hours of Le Mans for the Mustang Challenge.
Really?
Yeah. Wow. They announced that, I believe it was this weekend. It's interesting because right now the Mustang Challenge doesn't race in Europe. There's only the North American Championship, but I think I heard that maybe they'll be looking at expanding that to potentially another series, maybe in Europe, for instance. But yeah, it's going to be an invitational round for Mustang Challenge North America drivers, and Dark Horse are owners, I believe, that have the cars. So that is going to be quite interesting at Le Mans as well.
Yeah, very interesting. That's the first time I've heard of that. So it's still sanctioned by IMSA then, if it's the North American series?
That's a good question. I don't know that much, but yeah, I just heard that they're going to be at Le Mans. So
cool.
That's big.
It's
Ford bringing those to Le Mans means that they're serious about this new series and trying to drum up interest in it.
Absolutely. And with the amount of interest that is still lingering from the Garage 56 Camaro program last year, and the Mustangs running in the LMGT3 class there this year, just a massive fan favorite, more than I even expected in terms of the Garage 56 car from last year. The number of people this year who were either surprised it wasn't back or saddened that it wasn't back this year. So clearly the people over in Europe, be it they're from the UK or the French or some of the Americans that go over to that race, definitely love to see their naturally aspirated V8s, especially with the Cadillac and prototype as well. I've been told, both on YouTube and outside of YouTube, by people I know, that I'm being a bit too pessimistic with the current state of sports car racing. And the fact that we're now in this platinum era, if we're going to call it that, of sports car racing, with all these manufacturers in the hypercar category / GTP, and the stability that we're seeing in the series with the announcement that the rule set will be locked in through the 2029 season, that I'm just finding very minor things to nitpick about. And you know what? I will agree with you on that. So what I'm going to do this episode is try to stay as absolutely positive as possible. I know we have a red flag to discuss with the IMSA WeatherTech race, but we're gonna put all of the pessimistic thoughts behind here. This glass right here is 3/4 full, and we're gonna leave it that way. But yeah, we do have the 6 Hours of the Glen, the WeatherTech Sports Car Championship race to discuss. Stu, I'm going to let you take the lead on all of this, partially because you were there, and also partially because, as I said, I spent a good portion of the race one eye on my IKEA shelf and on one eye on the race. So I think you might have a little bit more to provide here than I might.
I might. It's not always quite, you don't get the same level of knowing everything that's going on when you're at the racetrack versus when you're sitting in the comfort of your home. So I think I got everything mostly down here. But one thing that we saw, regardless of that, all weekend long was, especially in the GTP class, was just how tight everything was between manufacturers, even including Lamborghini. I think that Lamborghini had a very good portion of this race up until they ran into their issues. But we saw through practice and qualifying, carrying forward into the race, we saw some great pace out of the four, I'll call them the main manufacturers, the four full-time manufacturers. We saw Louis Delatraz, the number 40 Acura, get pole. We saw, I believe it was, we saw one of the BMWs fastest in practice. We saw the Porsches and the Cadillacs also right there in practice. It was shaping up to be a really good weekend. But one thing that did throw everybody for a bit of a curveball was the weather, which we've touched on a little bit already. But the first sort of 3 days of running at the track. The WeatherTech Championship only starting on the Friday. The first 3 days of running at the track were under quite hot conditions. Temperatures were quite high. We were into the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. My temperature gauges are all a little bit mixed up right now, trying to go back from Celsius to Fahrenheit, but regardless, it was quite hot. We did have occasional bursts of rain, but generally speaking, it was pretty hot throughout the entire weekend. And then that was completely different for the Sunday race. We saw much cooler temperatures, lots of cloud cover, which we hadn't really seen at all throughout the weekend, except for the couple of brief periods of rain. And then, of course, as we got into the race, we had rain be a big factor as well. Just to touch a bit on qualifying, I mentioned that Louis Delatraz sat on the pole there. A great lap for him. Acura looked really strong, specifically in that qualifying session. It was PJ Hyatt that laid down actually an LMP2 track record in the 99 AO Racing entry. Daniel Serra in the 62 Risi Competizione Ferrari for GTD Pro. And then Parker Thompson got another pole in the GTD class for the number 12 Lexus. But one thing that became very clear before the race even got underway was that the bus stop curbing that was brand new in of course, the infamous bus stop was not going to be as big of a factor as maybe we had initially thought it might. The curbing, it was lacking one of the rows of curbs that we saw in some of the initial photos that were released. And as the weekend went along, drivers definitely got a lot more comfortable with the curbing, especially in the GT classes. In the prototype classes, they very much stayed off of it throughout the entire weekend, even throughout the entirety of the race, with the exception of a few moments. But the curbing wasn't really that big of an issue. Jumping forward into the race, I think the first half of the race especially can be defined by, a couple of big hits that we saw. There were actually a lot of really big hits that we saw throughout this race. We unfortunately saw an end to the LMP2 Era Motorsports winning streak. They had won the first 2 rounds of the season. We saw an end to that very, very early in the race, actually 3 laps in, when Dwight Merriman looked like he got a little bit of help, maybe got squeezed a little bit in the I guess it's not in the carousel, it's on that, what do they call this?
It's the entry to the carousel.
What was it, the entry to the carousel, or was it the entry
I'm thinking
to the boot?
the entry to the entry to the boot, really.
Actually, that a question for you. Have you ever heard that entry to the boot called the shoelaces before?
I don't think so. It's been a few years since I've been there, admittedly, but maybe that's like a local thing.
Well, no, they were talking about it a lot on the broadcast and always calling it the shoelaces. And I thought, I don't know if I've ever heard it called that before. But
I suppose it's a good description. I mean, yeah, I can visualize where that would be. Yeah,
we're really getting into the the boot references with this, though. You got the shoelaces, the toe, the heel. But yeah, that was an aside. Regardless, in the shoelaces to the boot, got squeezed a little bit, looped around, unsure of what really happened. I never saw any confirmation on what happened, so I don't know if you've heard or if anybody that's watching this episode live would be able to add in. But they broke something, it seemed like, in the rear end of the 18 era entry, because they were just kind of stranded there, and it led to our first full course yellow. I saw a photo from Connor Zilic later on that they had the entire rear end taken off of the 18 in the garage area. So yeah, you knew very early on that we weren't going to have a third win in a row for Era.
I will say, just quickly before you move on, I did hear from IMSA radio on the broadcast that when they got the car back in the garage, the clutch was in pieces. So that would be a pretty terminal thing to end their race.
That all adds up then. That adds up quite well, especially as to why they couldn't get going, because it did not look like they had any severe damage on the outside of the car from that. So
Right.
makes a lot of sense. We were able to get back racing relatively quickly. Short yellow, it doesn't take long to get back going. But before the 1 hour mark, the first major incident of the race occurred where the 04 CrowdStrike LMP2 got into the back of the Centelar Ferrari. This was also in the boot, sent the Ferrari into the wall very hard. The Ferrari was toast from this point, and actually led to a barrier repair under the full course yellow. So a bit of a longer full course yellow than usual. Did you have an opportunity to see this incident? And I didn't really get a good understanding of what happened. For me, it just looked like the 04 went straight into the back of the Centelar Ferrari, but IMSA ruled that it was a racing incident. So I don't know if you had seen anything else about that incident other than what I just said.
Yeah, I would sort of say the same thing, to be honest, as what you said. I mean, you have to think an LMP2 car, any car that's faster on track, it is supposed to be their responsibility to pass
Yeah.
cleanly. At the same time, if you're a GT car, your job is to be predictable. I would have to go back and watch that incident again to be a proper steward here with it. But I think IMSA taking the chaotic neutral by just deeming it a racing incident and having no further action on it.
Yeah, it should be noted both the bronze drivers, I believe, were in the car. I know George Kurtz was in the 04. And I believe, I can't recall who the bronze driver is for Centelar, but I believe it was both bronze drivers in the car. Regardless, a long, lengthy cleanup for that. And we would go back into this cycle of green flag racing for a little bit, and then we would have another couple of incidents before the halfway mark in this race. The first one was the car that we just can't stop talking about, unfortunately, and it's not for all the right reasons. The 33 Sean Creech Motorsports, the only Ligier that's in the field, they had a big crash that ended their race. This was on the exit of turn one. I didn't see what caused it, didn't see a replay, but I think it's based on what it looked. It seemed like probably just got on the exit curb and looped it around a bit, brought out a full course yellow, and then it wasn't too much longer after that we had another big wreck. Like, there were, again, I said it before, there were so many big wrecks in this race. Perhaps the biggest one of the race was for the number 55 Proton Mustang, which lost it on the exit of turn 10, got into the wall hard, and threw debris everywhere across the track. The number 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin, driven by Zach Robichon, I believe at the time, he looped it around, kind of in solidarity, got into the wall, and their race was essentially ruined after that. At that point. But this was also right around the time in the race where there was rain that started to fall down. And this would go on to be a big talking point in the second half of this race. Chris, I don't know if you had any thoughts sort of on the opening 3 hours of action that we had. I know I didn't talk much about the on-track racing that was going on. There was a lot of good on-track racing that was going on, but also a few big wrecks that hampered the running.
Yeah, well, the first half, 3/4, maybe even more than that, if you're talking about the Daytona 24 or Sebring 12 hours, I suppose, of any IMSA endurance race in particular, is generally just about survival. The wave around rules in IMSA and the full course yellow rules are generous enough that they'll probably get you back in the running as long as you're not multiple laps down. If you're one lap down, you can probably find your way back to the front on strategy and then just getting a wave around. And ultimately, like you said, this was a race of attrition, and not necessarily for reliability reasons, just more in terms of how many cars were going off track. It's not uncommon at Watkins Glen. I think we both agreed in the preview episode last week that we sort of expected a bit of carnage going into this race weekend. It seems like it always sort of fosters that style of racing. People last year, and actually we made a point of this last episode as well, people last year were very critical about some of the LMP3 incidents that we saw on track. And you and I said at the time, well, look at where the LMP3 drivers are now. They're in quicker cars. Let's not just all put it up to what cars they may be driving. So yeah, we saw a little bit of that in there. I don't think you mentioned, and I can't remember if this was before the rain started or after. I believe it was before. The 31 Whelen Engineering Cadillac. Was it Durrani in the car? No, it wasn't Durrani. It was Aitken, I believe, on his outlap or second lap out on track, spinning it in the bus stop as well, and losing quite a bit of time in the number 31 car. That really, when you said the car we're talking about for all the wrong reasons, I thought that might be the car you were going towards, because they really can't seem to be catching a break this season either.
Yeah, we actually saw that spin happen at the time. I believe that they were running in second or third, trying to chase down the leaders. They had strong pace at the time, but just lost it on the exit of the bus stop. And unfortunately, we had, what did we have? I think it was 46 cars there this weekend, when they're all ripping around, spread out a little bit at this point. So never really had a great opportunity to get the car flipped around very quickly and going the right direction. But was able to do that. Jack Aitken really had a rough race. He had a spin later on in the rain as well. Just even though Jack was showing strong pace throughout the weekend, just not a great race from that number 31. They would fall one lap down. Eventually they would fall a second lap down, and never really able to gain that back. One of the cars that was really, really impressive, and I think this is probably the first time that we can say that we've genuinely been impressed with this car since probably last year, was the JDC Miller Motorsports entry, the number 85. They were flying in the first stint of this race. They went and they eventually took the lead. They really looked very, very strong. And unfortunately, in the second half of the race, they would take out the RFID readers on the exit of pit road. And that ultimately, that ruined their race. They picked up a 5-minute stop and hold penalty for that. So that's one way to ruin your race. But that car, for the first time, I think, since last year, looked really, really strong.
Yeah, I mean, on the opening laps of the race, was it Phil Hansen behind the wheel during the start?
Was.
Yep. I was looking at how strong they were in the opening laps and thinking, damn, were they a sleeper pick? Should I have picked them to go for the overall win? JDC's been a sleeper at endurance races in the past. They've won Sebring back in 2021. They won, actually, the first time I went to the 6 Hours of the Glen, back when they were running the Orica 07 in 2018. They won that race with the car number 99 at the time. So yeah, I mean, the opening laps of the race in particular, right up until we got that first yellow, I was very impressed with the performance that Phil Hansen was getting out of that car.
Yeah, actually, I was looking at the B pillar does a good report and ranks drivers based on what their average lap times were. Phil Hansen was actually the quickest average driver in the GTP class this past weekend, which really says something. This is a guy that was running in the LMP2 class last year. Very much deserving of a ride in the top level of prototypes, and finally got that break with JDC, and is looks like he's really starting to settle in nicely with that car. So good. It was really good to see them out front and looking really strong. And if it hadn't been for that penalty, we very well could be talking about JDC at the very least being on the podium with the pace that they showed.
Yeah, and Phil Hansen coming off a strong run at Le Mans too, in the Jota 963. So
that is true. That is true. So carrying on with the second half of the race, and this is where things got a little bit wet. I mentioned a moment ago the rain was starting to fall. It was really interesting. So during that full course yellow, during one of those full course yellows, right essentially at the halfway mark, we got some rain that started to fall. And enough to the point where the track was wet, and teams needed to come in and put rain tires on the cars. This didn't last that long. The system had moved through, and it didn't take long before the track was starting to dry out, and teams were going to be going back onto the dry weather tires, the slicks. However, there's always this weird transition point going from wets to slicks. And it's not necessarily with the main racing line on the track. We see it a lot with the curbing. And this caught out the Iron Dames quite a big way, as Sarah Bovie was behind the wheel. And unfortunately, she touched a wet curb and had quite a large impact as a result of it. The Iron Dames were not able to continue in the race. And unfortunately, Sarah Bovie was actually taken to hospital later on as a precautionary measure, which she was ultimately held overnight for observation. It turns out that she is okay. She was released, but a big hit for them. And Sarah Bovie, who was also slated to be running the 24 Hours of Spa this week, is not going to be able to compete in that. And unfortunately, Iron Dames have withdrew that entry. So pretty unfortunate here that Iron Dames, who looked pretty quick this weekend as well, they have this big accident, and now unfortunately we're not going to see them at Spa this weekend.
Yeah, chalk them up as a team that just can't catch a break in 2024. They really sold their soul, I guess, for that win at Bahrain last year in the WEC Championship finale. But yeah, there's not too much more for me to say about that. It's just another bad break for the team. That how many times this season are we going to say they looked very strong, could have been a potential contender, and they end up coming a little bit short, whether it's reliability or it's just a simple mistake in the race that ends their day entirely. Always seems to be something.
It ends their day and then ends their next weekend as well. Like that's a tough pill to swallow for them, but they're gonna come back stronger. They're definitely getting better, especially stateside. They've already proven that they can go out and win in the World Endurance Championship, as you just said. They're getting stronger stateside, learning the tracks. They're going to be. I'm expecting good things from them here as in the last two Michelin Endurance Cup races of the season.
Yep.
So after this incident happened, this is when things got interesting. That wasn't that long of a full course yellow, actually, to get that all cleaned up. But I think it was half an hour, 45 minutes after this, the real threat of rain started to emerge. There was a big system that was approaching the track, and I don't think anybody really predicted that it was going to be as big as it turned out to be. As with about an hour and 45 minutes to go in this race, there was a massive downpour that came up so quickly over the track. I remember we were hearing over the speakers that there was heavy rain in the pit road area, and then we could see it coming up through the Esses and down the back straightaway towards us, and it was an immediate scramble to try and batten down the hatches. It was an immediate scramble on track, as well as there were some cars that were able to dive into the pits early enough in this sort of chaos to get wet weather tires on, but there were a ton of drivers and cars that were left on track that had slicks on. And as a result of this, there were a good handful of cars that went off or hit the wall in various degrees everywhere around the track. There was the number 11 TDS Racing LMP2 that it was a huge hit into the turn one tires, but it didn't actually pick up that much damage as a result of it, which I thought was kind of wild. I actually think they were able to drive that car back around the track. And it was a wild few minutes. We saw a big crash for the 78 Lamborghini as well in all of this happening. I believe the number 5 Proton Competition Porsche 963 had an off during this as well. The 31 Cadillac, they went off into the gravel here. There was a Ferrari that was off in the gravel. It was an absolute downpour. And it really led to a very chaotic, 15 minutes of this race. I don't know. I don't know if I imagine that this caught your attention away from the IKEA instructions.
Well, it certainly did when they threw a red flag. I'll say that much. It was sort of like a repeat of the 24 Hours of Le Mans from a week earlier, where we knew that rain was coming. I don't think anybody, unless they had their eyes glued to the radar, knew quite how much rain was coming. One of the things you mentioned earlier is that the rain in this race was very periodic, I guess I'll say. Like, it would come
Yep.
and then rain, it would pretty much downpour for a few minutes, it would seem, and then it would just stop. And then very quickly, it was blue sky again. That's one of the things that was pointed out multiple times in the broadcast. I think you actually told me from the track that you could see blue sky 2 minutes after it was downpouring at probably its hardest. Um, a very tough race for the teams to get the strategy for, because you have to decide whether it's worth it to go to wet weather tires, how long the rain's going to last, and then it turns into a massive downpour. You're stuck in the earlier stages of the track. You have to now get around this. How many miles is Watkins Glen? 3 point something mile track.
Something like that.
Convert for kilometers. And because of how quickly the rain ended up coming on a couple different occasions, it caught a lot of people out, like you said.
Yeah, and it was really interesting how the weather was behaving at the track all weekend. There were a number of big systems that were moving towards the track. And right as they got to the track, they immediately broke up and kind of broke on both directions around the track. With Watkins Glen being up on a very large hill, basically, it causes the weather systems to do some interesting things around the track, and we definitely saw that. Especially, I believe it was on Friday and Saturday. We saw interesting weather patterns. And this kind of carried through into Sunday, dodging some patches of rain, but then others like this one just coming down in a torrential downpour. It was, you couldn't see, the 600-meter board from the bus stop. It was pretty wild. And all while this was going on, we had, since the full course yellow had been deployed at this point, you have a safety car that's running around that probably that can go the fastest of any of the cars out on track because of the weight that it has. It has, the rain tires on, or grooved tires on at that point. But you have a bunch of prototypes and GT cars that are still on slicks, and they just could not catch the safety car. They couldn't catch up. I think, I don't know if you could hear on the broadcast, did they say that they were trying to slow down the safety car, I think, to bunch up the field, or did you catch that?
Yeah, well, it was definitely mentioned that a lot of the cars on slicks just could not stay at safety car pace, which is already pretty low as it is. One of the arguments that got brought up is, should IMSA have opened the pit lane and allowed these teams that were essentially stuck on slick tires because the pits were closed when the yellow flag came out, should IMSA give them a free pit stop to go in and change for wet weather tires? Because you have to at least respect at that point that it becomes a bit of a safety question, leaving all of these cars out on dry, slick tires, and the pits are closed. They could come in to do an emergency service. They're going to want to do everything in their power to not do that, so they don't have to come in again or when the track goes back green. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think that's something that IMSA should have looked into?
I don't know. I don't know if they should have done that. I think what they probably should have done earlier than they did was red flag it, because it was very clear to me at the track. They did a good number of laps around the safety car, with the safety car rolling around with them trying to get the field caught up. I thought it was pretty clear at one point that, like, this rain is kind of crazy right now. Visibility is low. I was surprised that the marshals posts could see one another from at all portions of the track with how bad the rain was. Usually that's one of the reasons why they'll throw a red flag, is if the marshal posts can't see each other, then they kind of have to. But I think maybe if you throw the red flag a little bit earlier, then there is that opportunity. Obviously, the field is going to be bunched up as a result of that. Even if it's a short red flag, it lasts 15, 20 minutes. And then you can get going. And because don't forget, there are track workers that were out on track trying to clean up accidents as well, all around the circuit. There were cars still sliding off during this, just trying to catch up to the safety car. The 57 Windward Mercedes was one of them. They almost got into the wall. I think maybe the solution was to red flag it a little bit sooner, but it's really hard to do that in that situation as well, because you don't want to be, what if you red flag it and it turns out that it's not actually that bad, like 3 minutes later, then you look like a fool. So it's a tough spot for race control to be put in, I think.
Yeah, and you could also make the small argument that even running around the track under safety car speeds is going to dry the track quicker than just red flagging it and having all the cars stopped in the pit lane.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the approach IMSA was taken. It's very easy to say everything in retrospect. I would agree with you with what you said. I think if they threw the red flag essentially right away, once we saw all these cars going off track, and once we really knew that this was not something that they were going to be racing in, go ahead and throw the red flag and let everybody return to pit lane as safely as they can.
Yeah, and luckily here we didn't actually get any lightning that came with this storm as well. Initially, when they announced the red flag, I had thought that it was because maybe there was some lightning in the area. We actually heard a clap of thunder while all this was going on, but it wasn't. It turned out it wasn't for that. There was standing water down in the boot portion of the track. I believe it was pretty bad there, or water streams of water going across the track. So they had to get that taken care of. But yeah, it led to a red flag period for, if I'm not, it was 40 minutes of red flag that we were under. And yeah, as I said to you, not long after they decided to red flag, maybe 10, 15 minutes after they threw the red flag, the sun emerged and was beating down hard like it had been earlier in the weekend. And and another 10 minutes after that, you could see sort of a dry line emerging right at the crown of the racetrack. It was very clear that we were going to go back to green flag racing at some point. It was just a matter of, at this point, they needed to get all the drivers back to their cars. They needed to get everybody back ready to go racing. So thankfully, we were able to get back going racing. We got about 15 minutes of a sprint to the finish line. There was a car, if I'm not mistaken, there was a car that went off the track in the lead up to green flag, though, wasn't there? While they were running under full course yellow, getting ready to go back green.
Well, when was I might be doing a spoiler here, but when was the Wayne Taylor Racing Andretti car?
Was that yeah,
the red? Okay.
Yep, that was it, actually. You're right. Yes, that's it. That's who it was, because we could see at the end of the back straightaway, the Wayne Taylor Racing Acura just sitting there and delaying us going green. Yeah, they lost the one of the rear tires, was it? Yeah, it came off completely, didn't it?
Yeah. After contact with one of the Penske Porsches going into the bus stop. I don't know if you had seen that. I guess
no, I did not know about that.
That was something that was brought up. It looked like I'm trying to remember which Porsche it was. Somebody's probably gonna have to help me out with that. But going into the bus stop before all of the rain had come, they had made contact, very light contact, going into the bus or on the straight leading up to the bus stop, and they think that might have been one of the reasons why that wheel came loose.
Interesting. Yeah, and it's a shame for them, because again, the Acuras, they weren't as strong in the race as some of the pace had looked throughout the weekend. But they were still right up there in the running for this one. And it looked like an unfortunate way for the number 10's race weekend to end. Just more, you mentioned bad luck with the Iron Dames. Was it with the Iron Dames? I think it was. Bad luck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Iron Dames, bad luck. 31, bad luck.
Yeah, 33. Well, 33's kind of created some of their own bad luck, but
Yeah,
yeah, bad luck all around. And the number
18.
10 was was definitely victim of that. So we did end up getting the race ended on a positive. The race ended on a positive. We went back green with just over 15 minutes to go in this race, and we had a great run to the finish line. Like there was great. There was a even though the battle never really got to unfold in the GTP class. The 40 led us back to green, and was not good on the restarts. I think we had somebody mention Mr. Waffles
Yeah.
in the in the comments here that the Acuras were awful on the restarts. And it was no different on this one. The 40 dropped like a rocket. It kind of thought that maybe something was broken with the car, with just how slow they were off the restart. So the 40 fell really out of contention. But the 0-1 and the 7 were really close to one another, but we never really got to see that great battle unfold between the two of them in the lead to the finish. LMP2, just with everything that had gone on there, we didn't again see a great close finish. But then in the GT classes have they rarely fail to disappoint. In the GTD Pro class, it was we had what was it? We had one of the Mustangs that was leading. I believe the Mustangs were leading late, but they had a slow pit stop. Yeah, the 64, I think, had a slow pit stop. Yeah, because the 65 had their brakes catch on fire in the opening stint of the race. But the 64, had a slow pit stop, fell out of contention. And then we had the number 4 Corvette on the start of, the last lap of the race.
Yep.
They found out that they weren't going to make it on fuel, and they had to dive in for a splash. That is heartbreaking as they continue to look for that first win with that car. Well, the first win with that car in IMSA. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, and they were one lap away from it, like you said. And Tommy Milner, Nicky Katzberg in that car ended up dropping down from the lead. And because we only had a short dash to the finish, it's not like they lost 3 or 4 positions. They ended up falling way down in the order to 7th, which was, I was going to say the last car in the lead lap, but that was actually the number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW taking those honors. But yeah, I mean, like you said, heartbreaking for them. They have shown enough pace recently with that car, with that Corvette. What's the name of it? Z06 GT3R.
Yeah.
that a win is certainly coming for them. I would be pretty surprised if we don't see a win out of that team this season, or if not a win from them in the GTD Pro class, at least a win for the AWA, the sole AWA number 13 car in GTD. They've looked very strong the past few races, and a big turnaround from where they were at the start of the season.
Yeah, they're growing. Ford is getting stronger as well. The Mustang did look strong in this race. They definitely could have contended for a podium, if not for the win, had it not been for that last little mistake on whatever the mistake was on their pit stop, that slow pit stop. Let's actually talk about the results, because kind of started talking about that a little bit. Yep. On the GTD podium, it was the number 7 Porsche Penske Motorsports 963 of Dane Cameron and Felipe Nasr that took the win there. They are the first car to win multiple times this season. The 01 Cadillac, Chip Ganassi Racing Cadillac, finished in second. They looked strong again all race. They after all the bad luck that they had earlier in the year and all the bad luck that they had throughout last year, they're starting to put something together here, and they're looking strong. And then rounding out the podium was the number 6 Porsche of Nick Tandy and Mathieu Jaminet. One of the things we actually did not touch on at all in the GTP class was the number 25 BMW. And they got into Connor DeFilippi behind the wheel, got into a pretty big accident in second practice on Friday. It necessitated a replacement chassis to be brought in. Or maybe it was second practice was actually on Saturday morning. That was when that incident took place. And and they had to bring in a replacement chassis. They sent crew members to, I believe, Indianapolis to pick up what they needed and drive it back. It was a pretty crazy I guess it's more than a few hours for that team, but they were able to get this car put back together. They were able to make the race, which was very impressive that they were able to do this. And they end up walking away with a sixth place finish as a result. So, it's not the result that BMW would want after showing such strong pace here last year. But still, for them to walk away with a fifth and sixth place finish with their two cars, considering everything that they went through, isn't too shabby.
Well, and they had good pace there this year as well. I mean, I noted that they topped one of the practice sessions. I can't remember exactly which one.
It was I think it was the first one.
The 25 BMW made a good recovery in the race. I think that's a point that we neglected a little bit. Having to start from the pit lane for needing that replacement chassis, they ended up coming home sixth. I think you did mention that, but also the 24 car.
Started from the pit lane, and they had to serve a drive-through.
Yeah, and the number 24 as well looked pretty promising throughout the race, except for the end where they really didn't seem to be as strong. With the more damp track conditions after the restart, sort of similar to what we saw with the Acura as well.
Yeah. So lots of good takeaways, I think, especially from the GTP class this weekend. We've talked about virtually all of these cars at one point or another. Lamborghini with the SE63 kind of had their first race where, they still completed a majority of the laps, but they had an issue. I'm not exactly sure what that issue was. I didn't see what the issue was. They ended up not being able to finish the race. So would have been nice to see them make it to the finish, but they showed strong pace as well in the early parts of this race, running, I believe around 7th or 8th in the opening stages of the race. So they're definitely getting stronger here as the season goes on.
Yeah.
In LMP2, we had the number 88 Richard Mille AF Corsa. I almost said Ferrari. AF Corsa LMP2. Maybe someday. Win in the LMP2 class. Luis Perez Campang. I think I pronounced that right. Probably not. Nicholas Nielsen, fresh off of a very nice run at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and Lila Wadu that picked up the win there.
Yeah, a great outing for there. Quite a historic run for that car. Lila Wadu being the first woman to win an IMSA since Catherine Legg in 2019, was it? Trying to remember the exact year, but I do know it was Catherine Legg, last woman to win an IMSA race. And then, like you said, Nicholas Nielsen coming off you described it as a decent result at Le Mans. I think that's a bit of an understatement.
No. I said I think a decent run. A decent run.
Okay. Well,
he could have been better. He could have been exceptional.
Yeah. Bit of a deja vu, though, finishing the race for that team at Watkins Glen a week after finishing for the number 50 Ferrari, where they, of course, won at Le Mans. So not a bad week if you're Nicholas Nielsen.
Definitely not. The number 74 of the 74 Riley entry in LMP2. They actually also went off during the full course yellow that led to an eventual red flag, but they were able to rebound from that nicely and finish second in class with the number 52 Inter Europol entry rounding out the podium there. In GTD Pro, we talked about this a little bit. It was not the Ford Mustang that won. It was not the Corvette that won, but it was another new car to the IMSA grid this year, the Aston Martin Vantage GT3 Evo, that picked up the win there. The number 23 Heart of Racing entry. They were able to capitalize on others' mistakes and walk away with the win there. They beat out the number 9 Pfaff Motorsports McLaren. Pfaff starting to put a couple of solid results together. And then rounding out the podium was one of the Corvettes, the number 3 Corvette of Antonio Garcia and Alexander Sims. So there was some great running in the pro class here. We had the top 8 finishing on the lead lap. And notable here is Rexy. Rexy finished 6th in this 11 car class. So that we had talked about, Rexy starting to get a bit of a grasp on a solid grasp on the championship lead, and this kind of giving some points back to some of Rexy's competitors,
Humbling them a little bit.
humbling them a little bit. Yes, indeed.
Can I also just say, I know I said I was going to be optimistic this episode, but how come how many times have I picked the 23 Heart of Racing Aston Martin this year, whether it be an IMSA or the World Endurance Championship? And of course, the one race where I'm like, no, just give it to somebody else. This is what happens. But I digress.
Well, I think there's a common theme there with our picks. So, as soon as we stop picking the 31, if we don't pick the 31 for Road America, the 31 is going to win.
I might have to be giving him a hand here. I might have to go away from my policy of picking them until they win. Hey, Whelan, if you want to sponsor this podcast, I can assure you that that's not going to happen. I'm not going to pick the 31 car anymore this season.
That's true. But, I think we both have space behind us. We get some nice lights, flashing lights from Whelan.
I'll replace that Toyota flag right back there with the Whelan flag. I don't care.
There we go. Perfect. And then finally, the last class that we have yet to dive into was the GTD class. There it was. Goodness gracious, Windward Racing. Are they going to lose? I think I said in one of the lead up video that I did that, Windward Racing looks like they could take a run at the number of wins that Paul Miller Racing had in this class last year, and they just continue to put down the wins here. They win again. This is their fourth win of the season. Pretty incredible. Or this has to be their fourth win of the season, is it? Sebring, Daytona.
Off the top of my head.
Sebring, Daytona. Did they win Laguna? I can't remember. Finishing second in class was the number 34 Conquest Racing Ferrari. They had some damage on that car post race for sure. I think they were one of the cars that ended up spinning off the track too during the full course yellow period. And rounding out the podium here was the number 44 Magnus Racing. Again, the Aston Martin Vantage GT3 Evo. I don't believe that they initially crossed the line in third. There were a number of post-race penalties that were handed out here in the Pro-Am classes, specifically 3 driver lineups. And this came into play a lot because of the red flag running period and teams not counting on the red flag period coming out. They got caught out with drive time. There were a few cars that missed minimum drive time by 3 to 4 minutes. I think the number 70 the number 70 Inception Racing McLaren, they missed minimum drive time by like half an hour, so they weren't close at all. But there were a couple of cars that definitely got caught out by minimum drive time here, and as a result of it, you have some cars that you might not necessarily normally see on the podium. Number 44, it's been quite a while, but good to see them on the podium.
Yeah, but let's not discredit them either. I think Magnus was a talking point while we were under the red flag about how strong they've been at some endurance races in the past, and it's great to see them finally getting back on the podium here.
Yeah, definitely. You're 100% right. Don't want to take anything away from them. A strong run from them. Was there anything else that stuck out for you in the GTD classes?
I would say GTD Pro was really the star of the show in that short restart to the finish. I mean, you mentioned how many cars we had on the lead lap. The 2 prototype classes really sort of spread out. It looked like Porsche was the defined favorite in GTP on the restart. We already mentioned the AF Corsa, or the Richard Mille AF Corsa Orica and LMP2. But it looked like it could be anybody's game on the lead lap in the GTD Pro class. And then GTD also having some battles for the race win as well. It was great to see them getting some of the spotlight as we hit the end of those another endurance race.
Yeah, it certainly was. There were a couple of news stories as well to touch on coming out of the 6 hours of the Glen, and one of them being John Doonan and talking about some potential LMDH brands that could be coming in future seasons. I believe he spoke about this in a SportsCar 365 article. He also spoke about this in a chat with Marshall Pruitt. You can watch that on the IMSA YouTube channel. And really interesting here, probably coming in light of the announcements that were made at last week's 24 Hours of Le Mans, with the period for the GTP and hypercar classes to be extended through to 2029. Lots of these discussions and this news probably coming in light of that announcement. But yeah, we could have some new brands that are coming in the coming years. No names were specifically dropped. But Zach Brown and McLaren there were discussions on this earlier in the week. I saw an article again on SportsCar 365 talking about this. There has also been word that, Hyundai has had some personnel. They had some personnel in the paddock at Le Mans. I believe I also saw that they might have had some personnel in the paddock at Watkins Glen as well, talking with some team representatives. So there's definitely buzz still around the LMDH regulations, whether it be LMDH, hypercar, whatever it might be, and manufacturers looking to enter the sport, which I don't think any of us are going to complain about.
No, absolutely. We talked last week about these regulations getting extended and the current homologated cars being extended through the 2029 season. And what that really brings are two different things. It brings stability, and it brings opportunity for some new manufacturers that have not committed to the formula yet. So if you're an existing manufacturer, you're the Ferraris or the Acuras or the Toyotas or whoever of the world, you can run your current car through the 2029 season. And then if you're a manufacturer that's sort of been on the fence, let's say you're the McLarens or the Hyundais of the world, if you get the ball rolling right now and you're testing a car in 2025, a year from now, and you hit the track for a competitive debut in 2026, that is still giving you a 4-season run. 26, 27, 23, 4-year run at least under this current rule set, which is really big if you're a new manufacturer. I think a lot of things that I already talked about this in a previous episode that sort of hurt the DPI formula is how quickly there were talks about replacing it.
Yeah.
And we started out that formula with 3 different manufacturers. We had Nissan, Cadillac, and not Acura.
Acura?
No, not Acura at the start. Other one, Nissan, Cadillac.
Mazda.
Yeah. How did I forget Mazda?
Yeah.
At the start of the regulations, and then Nissan left after a couple of seasons, and then Acura had came in with Penske at the start, of course being replaced by Meyer-Shank and Wayne Taylor Racing towards the end of the regulation cycle. But we really didn't see any new manufacturers enter the conversation about creating a car for that formula or that rule set because of how quickly there were talks about this next evolution of the DPI regulations, which is now, of course, what we have in the GTP class. And it certainly helps that these cars are now a truly global formula that you can run in 2 different worldwide championships, but 2 different championships, one of them being worldwide and one of them being a North American championship. I will say, I'll believe McLaren when I see it. When they're on the track, it's sort of like the approach I've taken with Aston Martin at this point. And I'm very glad that Aston Martin is still very much moving forward with that program. We've gotten some very great news out of that program recently. But after they had their sort of we're in the series and then we're not in the series from a few years ago, they're one of the manufacturers where I always said, I'll believe it when I see it. But now we're starting to get some formal confirmation that, yep, they have a car that's getting pretty close to being able to do some on-track testing. They should be doing some rollout this summer, I believe, with that car, if not in the fall. And then looking for a debut at the Daytona 24 Hours next year. McLaren, I've always sort of put in the same boat because Zach Brown will say, it's something we're evaluating, but I'm not too sure. I will say I have heard that there is a potential for a very big shakeup in the way that McLaren is running their current motorsports programs. A pretty significant shakeup if it ended up becoming true. Now, I will say right now, take that with a grain of salt the size of a sugar cube, because this is completely uh, base level rumor at this time. But still worth something considering. Still something worth considering. Zach Brown did say that if they wanted to have a car on the grid for 2026, they would have already had to have greenlit the program by now. They would have already had to have the initial concepts of the design ready by now. They would have had to start producing that car either late this year or early next year so they could be on track testing a year from now. He sort of seems skeptical about getting a debut on track in 2026. So I don't really know where that leaves him too much. But we'll wait and see. Trademark.
Yeah,
And
he's they would theoretically need to have that, but for all we know, they could be doing that right now. We don't hear about these programs becoming official until they're already fairly well down the line. So
right, and that yeah, that's definitely true.
yeah.
Although I don't know when the extended period of homologation would have been communicated to some of these prospective manufacturers, because the public, we found out about it last week. I don't know if some of these manufacturers would have found out about this months ago, that this was something that was coming. Who knows? Above my pay grade. And Hyundai, I will say they've been very interested in the hydrogen regulation of prototypes in past years. It seemed like if we were going to see them in prototype racing, that might be where they end up. Those hydrogen rule sets are getting pushed back seemingly just as much as the next generation of LMP2 cars have been. So perhaps they're trying to capitalize on getting some experience in prototype racing before those regulations come in. Perhaps they're being a little bit more skeptical about those regulations ever coming in at this point. But I would love to see both of those manufacturers on the grid. Absolutely. The big question is, as always, where do you find the space for them? But
yeah,
something's got to give. You're going to have to find something, because getting two more major OEMs on the grid for either the IMSA WeatherTech SportsCar Championship or the World Endurance Championship, or both, would be something nobody should ever be complaining about.
yeah, I think it's safe to say they'd find a way to make it work. IMSA's done a good job. Well, IMSA's done a. I'm going to say they've done a good job. Everybody might not agree that they've done a good job in shifting around the schedules to have a track like CTMP, where there is a pretty hard limit on the number of cars you can safely have, not only just in the pit lane but out on track. How they've managed that this year, with the GTPs being absent but LMP2s being a headliner. So they've gotten creative with how they've done things. I think that they could get creative to get a few more GTP cars or GTP manufacturers on the grid if they wanted to come.
Yeah. Good.
I was just going to say, sticking with sort of that vein of newer GTP manufacturers, just talking about the 2-car mandate in the WEC and how that may impact Lamborghini's IMSA efforts. So Lamborghini, of course, they understand that and are committed to the WEC with the 2-car hypercar class effort starting next year. Of course, they are running a single one this year. They're going to need to run 2 per the recent news there. But how might that impact their IMSA efforts? They aren't even sure. They did reiterate that they are committed to having a car on the IMSA grid, but are just unsure in what capacity that could be. Could it look like it does this year, where it's one car just for the Michelin Endurance Cup races? Could it still be, could that evolve to be a full season entry? It sounds like that is all still very much up in the air right now. But it's not great news to hear about this from an IMSA perspective, that, this 2-car mandate could potentially impact their IMSA program.
Yeah, not a great headline. And
No.
it's something that I reiterated multiple times that I was worried about. Now, if I'm the World Endurance Championship, I'm definitely not upset about having 2 Lamborghinis committed to my grid next year. But as a fan, particularly a North American fan who is pretty invested in both championships. It would definitely be a big blow to not have Lamborghini full time on the IMSA calendar next year. They're sort of one of those manufacturers that when I see them on the grid in an IMSA race, it's like, oh yeah, Lamborghini's here this weekend because they're only running 4 races this season. I if it was really up to me, I would love to see one car full time in both championships. It sounds like right now, if I had to put some money on it, we'd probably be seeing 2 cars in the world. We'll definitely be seeing 2 cars in the World Endurance Championship next year, but then likely just seeing what we're seeing this year in IMSA with a Michelin Endurance Cup entry from them, and then potential for a second car at the Daytona 24 Hours from the sounds of things. Also, all these stories that we're mentioning that came out of different publications over the weekend, I'm going to link those in the description and the podcast notes on podcasting platforms if you want to check those out for yourself, as I would encourage you to do so. But Stu, you as an IMSA fan primarily, I have to imagine that this is something that sort of you're not too thrilled about.
Yeah, it's disappointing to hear. In this SportsCar 365 article, it mentions that Lamborghini's initial plan was to have one full-time entry in each series, bring a second entry for the Rolex 24 and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. That was their initial plan. With this change, it means that their budget is kind of looking very different than it did when they initially made those plans. So, it would be very disappointing to see that Lamborghini program be scaled back in IMSA as a result of the WEC program needing that additional budget. But at the end of the day, as long as that car stays on the Endurance Cup championship, then I think that's a good thing. One of the things that makes me think about, though, and we've talked about this sort of with Cadillac and the WEC, is that, if you're only running one car in a championship, it can be very difficult to have a lot of success with that car. You're just not getting as much data as everybody else. But that's even amplified more when you're only running selected races in a championship. If you're only running the Michelin Endurance Cup Series races, I have a very difficult time seeing that car being competitive consistently. And then really at that point, you question, what's really the point other than it being a marketing exercise. So,
Right.
definitely there's a lot for Lamborghini to think about here. And hopefully at the end of the day, they are able to find the budget space to make this work. Maybe they can get creative with it. We've heard stories from coming out of, the Asada Freschini camp of how can they get a second car on the hypercar grid next year? Could they do some sort of a partnership with a privateer entry? I mean, could Lamborghini do something similar to that if there is a team out there that has budget and would be willing to run sort of a customer car, but sort of in a almost not a factory capacity,
like outfit,
but
sort of.
yeah, kind of like that.
Factory clothes on.
Yeah, they get the factory uniforms and stuff, but they're a customer team. So I don't know, maybe they could get creative and find a way to do something like that, and that gives Lamborghini the budget flexibility that they need to make this work. But man, there's some uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty around there right now. It sounds like.
I would love to see them try to get creative and do something like that. The thing that I mentioned, I think last week, is actually, maybe I didn't mention this on this podcast. Maybe this was off the cuff, me rambling to some friends, but I do know that the trend we've seen from a lot of manufacturers is they really want to have control over the cars that are representing them. The rare exception to this seems right now to be Porsche for the most part, who's encouraging many different customer programs with that car. That's sort of the foundation for that entire program, is making it very customer friendly. A lot of these other manufacturers, we haven't seen them be as open to running customer cars, or as you sort of outlined it, factory clothed people in the hands of a customer team.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's something that would really be interesting to them, but it's something I would definitely welcome if they were. The other issue that really arises from it, though, I think, is for the IMSA officials. And if you're running a limited schedule, it's a lot more difficult for them to come up with a fair balance of performance for that SC63 than it is for them to come out with a balanced performance set for the Porsches or the Acuras or the Cadillacs, or the Aston Martin. They'll be running full season next year, it seems, because they'll be running significantly more races and they'll have significantly more data coming out of those cars. So I would have to wonder if that's going to hamper Lamborghini's potential to be properly competitive in the IMSA Championship. So far, we haven't seen that program be uber competitive well, they've only run 2 races, so I don't want to take too much away from them. But it does seem like they're starting to come to grasp quicker with the WEC program than they might be in IMSA.
Well, I mean, it's not just the GTP program that hasn't necessarily been uber competitive. We haven't seen that GTD program, any of those cars, be uber competitive. I would argue. We've seen glimpses from them,
Right.
but we see, in the pro class, the Iron Lynx entries, it can be difficult. I know that the GTD car is kind of a little bit of a different beast because you do actually have cars running that, or teams running that in a full season capacity. But I think there's a lot that's reflected there on Iron Lynx as well, and not a knock on them at all. But when you're only running a selected number of races in a championship, it can be difficult to get a better grasp on just things like, the rules, different procedures, just being accustomed to a lot of these North American tracks. So, yeah, there's lots of challenges that could present themselves with this Lamborghini SC63 program if it maintains in a very limited capacity in North America.
Yeah. Well, as I said at the beginning of the episode, this glass is still more than half full. So
Yeah.
I'm going to remain optimistic about the future of that car in the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship. But we'll see as we continue through the middle of the season as we are right now, and then also leading into next year. I'm sure we'll get some more news out of that camp.
One thing that we
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say one
here.
thing that we can be very
You
optimistic
stole my
about
show.
here. Did I steal the line?
That's where I was going.
Oh man, well.
Go ahead. You started it.
Well, one thing that we can stay very optimistic about, though, is that Pipo Derani will certainly find a ride in a GTP or a top-level prototype car for next season, after it was announced that he's not going to be returning to Action Express Racing in the number 31 after this season. I don't know about you, but this news absolutely floored me.
Yeah.
I can't recall how long Pipo has been a part of Action Express Racing. But he's been a fixture in the top class of IMSA for many years now. They won the championship last year. They've won a ton of races together. I struggle to understand how this makes sense in my head that Pipo and Action Express are parting ways. But yeah, what were your thoughts on this? This was wild news when I heard it come out on, I think, Thursday or Friday. It emerged.
Yeah. Well, definitely a big surprise, like you had mentioned. I had to confirm with myself that it was 2019 that he started racing for Action Express after coming away from Extreme Speed Motorsports before that. You want to talk about Pipo Derani as a driver who's extremely fast, extremely talented, but this year he's made a few mistakes, whether it's in a qualifying session, ultimately that mistake at Sebring that cost him the win. I have to wonder if those incidents weighed in on their decision to not extend his contract into next year. Although I'd have to imagine that some team is going to want to pick up Pipo Derani for next year.
Oh, yeah.
Still a ton of talent in that driver. A driver who really sort of came out of nowhere in sports car racing back in 2016 with a completely eye-opening drive at the end of the 2016 12 Hours of Sebring. in the Ligier JSP2 back then. And ever since, he's really been a main talking point in the series still. So I would have to imagine some team's going to be interested in picking him up. The main question is who, and the other main question is who replaces him at Action Express Racing / Whelen Engineering Racing. Initially, my mind said, "Oh, Tom Blomqvist, might as well." But no, Tom Blomqvist, from everything that we've heard so far, will be returning to Meyer Shank Racing next year. Mike Shank made it very apparent that he's still part of the Meyer Shank Racing family. It seems increasingly more likely that Meyer Shank Racing. Can I talk this episode? Meyer Shank Racing will be running another Acura ARX 06 program in the IMSA WeatherTech SportsCar Championship next year. So then who do you look at as drivers who might replace Durrani in the 31? Well, I'd say maybe you look at the drivers that we have in the Ganassi Cadillac right now. Renger van der Zande, Sebastian Bourdais, perhaps. Ganassi, I don't...
But then there's rumors that Ganassi might stay on the grid running one of those Acuras.
Well,
there's discussions on that. And you hear that the Ganassi drivers, I believe, are contracted to Ganassi as opposed to Cadillac. So you would think that they're going, especially Bourdais. I know Bourdais is contracted to Ganassi. So you think of that as well. It's... Sorry, I didn't mean to bowl you over there.
As time goes on, it seems less and less likely, to me at least, that Ganassi is going to pick up an Acura program next year. I've always sort of been under the impression that Ganassi won't be racing in sports car racing next year. I would like to be wrong about that. But all the signs so far have pointed to, or a lot of the recent signs, I should say, have pointed to the fact that they won't be running an Acura program next year. I think Marshall Pruitt was the first person to really bring that to light. We have seen a couple of other reports to the contrary, so we'll see. That's going to be one of the talking points as we continue through the 2024 season. If they are not running in the WeatherTech Championship next year, maybe a driver like Renger van der Zande goes over to the 31 car. Maybe the Cadillac Ganassi drivers in the World Endurance Championship, Alex Lynn and Earl Bamber, maybe one of them comes over to race in the 31. I'm not sure. That's, to me, the main question is who steps up full-time in the 31, because I don't think it's going to be Blomqvist, and I'm not sure who it could be apart from that.
Well, so I think I saw a quote from Chip Ganassi from at some point this past weekend, and he was saying that he's confident that they'll be on the IMSA grid in the top class in one form or another, which is interesting. I think bold. That was from this. Yeah, it is quite bold. But I'll tell you what this move brings a bigger question into my mind is what is the future of Action Express Racing? Because, this move makes no sense in my mind. I think, sure, people has made a couple of mistakes this year. Sure, he binned it in qualifying, but at Long Beach, but he still got pole. He binned it at Sebring. You could argue that was a racing incident. It was kind of a mistake on both of their parts. I think that we've seen plenty of drivers make plenty of large mistakes, bigger than what we've seen out of people this year, and have kept their jobs. Pipo is still one of the quickest drivers on the grid, and I just don't understand why they would part way with each other if there wasn't, something bigger at play here. And I've always been a little bit concerned ever since the rumors have been swirling about, Wayne Taylor Racing. It's pretty much all but a foregone conclusion at this point that Wayne Taylor Racing is going to assume those two Cadillac entries. We're just waiting for an announcement.
Right.
But what does that mean for Action Express Racing and all of this? Like, yes, they have been partnered with Cadillac for a long time now, but Cadillac has been very public in saying that there are budget constraints for this program. The World Endurance Championship has been more of the concern on that side, but is there anything there that is to be concerned about Action Express Racing's future? I don't know. I don't have anything to back it up, but it is a little bit odd losing your best driver, or I would say that Pipo Derani has been their best driver. Um, just odd.
At least their most decorated driver. We can
Yeah.
definitely say that without a shadow of doubt. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm definitely having in the back of my head as well, because we have two Cadillacs on the grid right now across two different teams, both sort of under that Cadillac racing banner in a way. Like, they're sort of both pseudo factory programs, especially the Ganassi car. So I would have to imagine Wayne Taylor Racing Andretti going to assume both of those cars next year if there's a spot in the Cadillac lineup for the 31 team. It's something that's in my head right now. I don't know though. I
Yeah.
don't really know what the future holds for that program. Um, there's
The,
somebody in
the,
the chat saying maybe people just got a better offer somewhere else, perhaps. Maybe he left on his own terms. I'm not sure.
yeah, like this there's so many different ways that this could go, right? People could the comment above that from Donald saying Alex and Earl are staying in the WEC with Joda. I mean, what if people just wanted a change of scenery? He's won in IMSA. He's won just about pretty well everything that there is to win. Why not try and go to the WEC and try and have a run there with sort of the factory supported, expected to be announced Joda program. Maybe it could be something as simple as that. We don't know, but I definitely am a little bit concerned about what this means for Action Express Racing heading into the offseason, because the only driver that we can assume that they'll still have on their roster is a very good one in Jack Aitken. But with it looking like, Tom Blomqvist is probably going to be returning with Meyershank Racing.
Yeah. Just one quick tidbit I want to throw onto this. Richard James from Racer.com saying that neither Action Express nor Cadillac has given any indication that AXR will not be returning with Cadillac next season. So,
yeah,
doesn't mean that it's a guarantee that they'll be back, but at least it's something that hasn't been sort of circulating around the IMSA paddock officially yet. So,
yeah,
we'll have to see. It's going to be the IMSA silly season in prototype is already very exciting right now, and this is only really adding on to it.
I love it. It's been a bit of it's been a bit of a slow build that's getting to this point, but you got to imagine that in the next couple of months over the summer, it is going to reach a boil over point. And once all these announcements start to fall, the first one is of course going to be who's going to be running the Cadillacs, and then we're going to be running from there. So we're in for a great summer of not just on track action in the IMSA WEC space, but we're also in for a great summer of off track announcements as well. With as we had talked about 15 minutes ago, we could be talking about new manufacturers emerging from the woodwork with plans to join the grid in, say, 2026 or something as well.
Yeah. Couple of comments that I want to get to, since I know we've been sort of neglecting that a little bit. Way back at the start, since this podcast has been going on more frequently, there's been a large rise in rain races. Coincidence? I already apologized for that on my behalf. Like I said, I'm perfectly fine with a rain race, but it seems like we've been having so much rain recently that it's starting to disrupt these races. We had that 5-hour safety car period at 24 Hours of Le Mans. We had the red flag at Watkins Glen. As I mentioned at the top of the show, it looks like we might have some more rain at the Spa 24 Hours this weekend. So maybe we'll have to stop or just at least rename the show.
The Sun Race podcast.
Doesn't quite ring as well. Doesn't match in with the channel branding either, does it? A couple of people talking about, especially, and this was something that we made a quick talking point about, but something maybe worth touching on a little bit more, is how apparent the cool tire issue was. I still can't talk, for the Acuras at Watkins Glen. Extremely apparent after the red flag restart, when they finally got going again with car number 40. Like you said, they restarted in the lead and then ended up finishing 22 seconds behind the race-winning number 7 Porsche. It's something that's not entirely new to that car, but I think it was really amplified here at Watkins Glen, and I was just surprised how much pace they lacked when the tires are pretty cool.
Yeah. So to be noted with this, the tire compound that they were running this weekend was the hardest tire compound that Michelin has. Michelin has a few different compounds of these tires for the GTP cars, and this was the hard compound. It's not indicated like it is in F1 or an Indy car by the tire wall color. It's decided at the beginning of the weekend, and with the exception of a couple of races where they have a couple of the compounds available, it's the same compound for that they're using throughout the entire race for the slick tires. This was the hardest compound, and you heard some of the drivers talking about throughout the weekend how difficult it was to get that tire into the correct operating window. Which was actually really interesting despite the very hot temperatures that we saw at times over the weekend. But I just wonder if the Acura does not agree at all with that harder compound tire.
How did you think the track conditions were when they actually did resume from the red flag? Would you say the track was still pretty damp, or do you think by that point there was enough of a dry line that it was pretty much full slick running?
Like I said, you could see the dry line developing at the crown of the in the very middle of the track before the cars even took to the track again. And by they were running around under sort of a full course yellow condition for a good 20 minutes before they went back green as well. So I don't actually think that the track would have been that affected or would have been that damp by the time they went back green. Sure, there were some patches of track, especially in the boot, that you could see there was some moisture that was still seeping down the track, but I think the track was in a pretty dry state at that point. That I don't think that would have played a huge factor. But then again, I'm not a tire engineer, so take what I'm saying with, what did you say earlier? A grain of salt the size of a sugar cube.
Yeah, that's all right. Came up with that one on the spot, by the way.
I like it.
Are there show notes about this podcast? If so, where can I find them? So I'm admittedly not too familiar with the way podcasts are set up on podcasting platforms everywhere. There is a description for it that should be available on any podcasting platform. I certainly put one in there when I publish it. Your mileage may vary based on what platform you're listening to it on, but we should be on all the major platforms. I try to keep an eye out to see if we can get them on as many as possible, and if there's any platform that you use that we're not on, just let me know and I'll try to get the show on there. But it should be available, at least as a description on whatever podcasting platform you're listening on. Some just more talk about Blomqvist potentially going in as the third driver for Meyershank, or not the third driver, going in as the primary driver for Meyershank Racing next year, which is what it seems like we're going to be getting next year as it stands right now. I think that is enough to call it for this episode, unless you have anything else you wanted to discuss.
No, just it was, all things considered, even though there was a lot of wrecks, a lot of hard impacts, which you never like to see. The racing was disrupted. We didn't really have a real extended green flag run in this race, but I still think coming out of this race, I personally leave pretty satisfied with what we saw. Despite the disruptions, we still saw some great battles in this race. We saw great battles in a lot of these classes for the win at the end. We still got to see a little bit of strategy seep in as well. With Corvette ended up running out of fuel, so that's obviously a strategy blunder, a very big one there. But we saw a little bit of everything in this race. It was a little bit crazy. It kind of fit the bill on what we've seen with the last few major endurance races, on rain being a big factor. I think we can probably all agree, though, that we're kind of done with rain being a factor, and we'd be okay with having some just races run clean. But overall, yeah, a good Watkins Glen race weekend.
Yeah, and just one more comment here I want to get your thoughts on. Someone saying, I was at Watkins Glen, like you were, and I was ready to see a race in the rain. Kind of disappointed they didn't race under the rainy conditions, but there was a lot of standing water. I think this brings forward a question, something that a lot of people could definitely argue about, that we discussed after Le Mans as well, is did they wait too long to release the cars? I know you talked about we were running under safety car for a considerable amount of time after the red flag. Was the red flag maybe a little bit too long for the drying track conditions? Maybe we could have gotten them there a little bit earlier and had a more proper rain race on our hands, I guess. But that's just one of those things that's going to be argued a lot. I think I would say I'll always argue on the side of let them go out a little bit earlier and prove themselves as the best drivers in the world, best sports car racing drivers in the world. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So
you were there, so
I was thinking about this a lot while we were waiting for the cars to go back green, because we were hearing that drivers have been told that we're going to be we're going back racing, going back out on track at X time. I think where this could be improved is in the red flag process. If we knew that this system was going to move through pretty quickly, that it in theory should be pretty short. I think what we should have done in this case was IMSA not allow the drivers to leave the cars, go off, whether they're going back to their trailers, whether they're going back to team trailers, whatever it might be. They have to stay either in the pit area and not stray far from the cars, because you got to think about, under these red flag conditions, if the drivers can get out and walk around, go back to a trailer, whatever, they have to be given heads up to return to the cars. So they were given 10 or 15 minutes to return to the cars, and then they get to the cars, they're rolling out. If we could have saved 10 of those 15 minutes, say, under the red flag, and got the cars back on track 10 minutes earlier, then I think we're talking probably about 10 minutes more of racing. Maybe the track's a little bit more damp. Maybe that's leading to some other storylines. It certainly wouldn't have been dangerous for them to go out 10 minutes earlier at that point. So IMSA has done a good job at taking learnings from things that have happened in recent years, because there have been a lot of controversial things at points in races that have happened, and they learn from it and they implement changes in the rules to prevent things or better the sport going forward. Hopefully they can look at this and maybe there's some learnings to be found from that. Maybe it's something as simple as, there's a red flag condition and they're just going to tell drivers to stay in the immediate vicinity of the cars so that we can go back to green quicker. That seems like a pretty simple fix to me. But personally, I was thinking about it in the moment. I don't know if there's anything that they could have done to get back to green flag racing sooner because of the IMSA processes that are in place. Like I said, there were a lot of cars that were still on slick tires. There were some cars that were on rain tires as well. And this was still a full course yellow condition, and the pits needed to be opened. They hadn't been opened yet. So there was a lot that was going on here. All that we can do is IMSA is going to take this away and learn from it, and see what changes come out of it.
Yep. And first of all, I do want to clarify, I'm not arguing that they should have been racing when the rain was at its absolute peak. I would be pretty wild to suggest that. But there is the argument to be made that the red flag procedures, or the case of Le Mans, the safety car procedures, is taking too long to end up going back green. But what are you going to say about it? There's not too much. I'm not going to, I'm being an optimist this episode. I'm not going to say too much to argue against it right now. I think that's enough to call this episode a wrap. We're at the average hour and a half mark, as always. We do have the CrowdStrike, the centenary edition of the CrowdStrike 24. Hopefully it's actually 24 hours of Spa this weekend, which is at least in terms of car count, the largest GT3 race in the world. So I'll be speaking for myself and say I'll be definitely tuning into that race to see some of our friends from the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship and then also the World Endurance Championship taking part in that race. And fighting for overall GT3 honors. You want to talk about a race that has plenty of GT3 representation, where GT3 takes the spotlight. You're not really going to get any bigger than that one. And like I said, their centenary race. Hopefully, we've given them enough reverse psychology here to not have that race get rained out and have the same fate that we had at Le Mans and Watkins Glen.
Wait, I know how we can fix this.
I do too. I think it's going to pour for 24 hours. In fact,
Bingo.
I'm willing to put it as my official prediction that race is going to be red flagged for 8 hours,
Lightning.
or slash under the safety car for 10 hours, and this race is going to get called after 57 minutes.
Yep.
Take it to the bank. All right. We're going to call it an episode there for this week of the Rain Race podcast. 3 weeks in a row. We're going to be taking an off week next week. We should be back in a couple of weeks. We got plenty more IMSA WeatherTech SportsCar Championship, World Endurance Championship coming up soon, Canadian Tire Motorsports Park. She'll be attending that one as well. And the IMSA 6 Hours of Sao Paulo making a return for the first time since 2014.
WEC 6 hours, not the IMSA.
Did I say IMSA? All right, not this year.
Not this year.
So thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Hope to catch you in 2 weeks' time. Take care.